Okay, NAL power ranking for week number 3. I did one before the season started, so going into week number 1, I did one going into week number 2, and then here is going into week number 3. I also had an intermittent one between play days 3 and 4, but I didn't make an actual video on that one. I just did the community post. So if I refer to a previous power ranking, I'm talking about the one going into week 2, so the last one that I made a video on, and also as I've been talking on the screen, should be the ranking from that video. So at the end of this video, I'll show how teams moved up or down, so how many placements they jumped or fell, I suppose. And okay, so 5 tiers here. It's not terribly significant. It's just a number that fits on the screen pretty well. If I want to, I can just put 2 teams in each tier. So if a team is in the same tier, maybe it's a little bit significant. Maybe I'll end up having some tiers with 1 or 3 teams in them, but the order is still the most important thing here. And okay, we're going to be starting at the bottom. Number 10 is Sonics. I think this is a pretty obvious choice. The Sonics have definitely looked like the weakest team thus far through the stage. They're the only team without a win, but I also think that they are, because of this fact, one of the teams with the most latent potential. They were one of the best teams from NA in the NAL last season, obviously only NA teams, and then even internationally, not doing too well at the majors, but doing very well at the 6th Invitational. So if they can start playing like they did last year in this stage, then they might go up the rankings. It's going to be pretty difficult for them to make it to the major. They've already gotten 0 points over the course of 4 play days, and there are only 5 more to go. In the very next play day, they play against Mirage, so maybe they can get a win there. That's another sort of low-tier looking team. But then the 4 play days after that, they play TSM, Oxygen, Dark Zero, and Space Station in some order, so that's a really tough schedule. If they don't get points against Mirage, it's entirely possible that they don't get points for the entirety of the stage. Relegation isn't a concern just yet. It's not great, obviously, if you don't get any points in a whole stage, but there are still 2 more stages to be played. But right, it does look very unlikely that they'll be going to this upcoming major. And right, they only got, 6 rounds over the course of 4 games. That's not even enough rounds to win a single game. And I mean, I don't really need to harp on too much about the rest of this. I think it'd be a much harder choice if Mirage had lost to TSM, but Mirage did beat TSM, so I think I can comfortably put them above Sonics. If Mirage had gotten smashed by TSM, yeah, this would be a lot more questionable. I think maybe even Mirage would still be above them because of just how badly Sonic's been beaten and by which teams they've been beaten, which we'll probably refer to a little bit more later when we talk about some of the other teams. Okay, so going onwards from here, there's a lot of pairs of teams that draw a lot of comparisons. So I'm just going to add 2 at a time probably, and then compare them to decide who's above whom. And I think you'll agree with most of the ordering at large, and then you can perhaps swap some of the pairs. So I think the other team that we talk about here is TSM. So Mirage and TSM. These 2 teams did play each other in this last week, and Mirage beat TSM. This is the reason why we're actually considering this. TSM is a point above Mirage on the standings, and that is because TSM has a win against Exet, and then they also have an overtime loss against Space Station, so that's 4 points there. And Mirage got the whole 3 points against TSM. So, okay, Mirage, they took losses to Dark Zero, Space Station, and Oxygen. Space Station and Oxygen look like 2 of the top teams this stage, if not just the top 2 teams. We'll talk about that when we get up there. And then they also lost to Dark Zero, who haven't been doing that well, but they're certainly not slouches. They were all decisive losses for Mirage. A 3-7 against Dark Zero and a 2-7 against Space Station, 2-7 against Oxygen. It's not great, but I guess if you're getting 2-7, it's the least embarrassing for it to be against like Oxygen and Space Station. It is what it is, but right, they do have the win against TSM, and all right, so TSM, they have a win against Exet, which is a solid win. Exet's going to end up being fairly high on the list. You'll see where they end up being. But that was in the first week where Exet just sort of didn't look like they'd fully woken up. And then in the second week, they looked incredible. I guess in terms of just pure round counts, they were far better than anyone else, only dropping a single round over the course of their 2 games. So it's a good win, but I do think it had a little bit to do with the fact that they got to play them in the very first week. That was the first week of competition for Exet and TSM, grizzled veterans. It shouldn't affect them nearly as much. There was a little bit of talk of the fact that TSM wasn't scrimming for a while. I think they took a little bit of a break after they won the 6th Invitational, so maybe some of the teams were a little bit more in practice than TSM, and perhaps that'll be less apparent going forward, where things equal out and TSM gets more into practice. But maybe that's not actually the reason. We'll see what the deal is with TSM. Probably in the next week it'll be quite telling. Okay, so yeah, I think it is fair to still have TSM above Mirage, and I guess one more time, did I miss something? I think TSM, right, they beat Exet, they lost to Oxygen, and I guess the one I didn't talk about much, they did go to overtime versus Space Station, so that is a loss, but they went to overtime, so that's good, taking a pretty good team to overtime. So I think all of this stuff added up together, I'm going to put TSM above Mirage. Maybe if Mirage had closer games against some of their opponents, I could have put them above TSM because of the head-to-head thing, but I think I'm going to go with TSM over Mirage. And unfortunately, this is just the bottom 3 teams from the standings in the same order, but it is what it is. Sometimes that's just going to happen. Okay, the next 2 teams I want to talk about are Parabellum and Dark Zero. Those 2 teams are both on 6 points, and so is Xset. We'll talk about Xset in a minute. Okay, Dark Zero and Parabellum, these 2 teams have played each other, and Parabellum took it over Dark Zero, and it ended up being a 7-4, so no overtime, no max regulation, so not a super decisive win, 7-4, but, you know, it's a fairly decent win for Parabellum. And, all right, in the first week, we saw Parabellum play against Beast Coast, and we also saw Dark Zero play against Beast Coast. Dark Zero beat Beast Coast, but it was very close, went all 15 rounds. Parabellum lost to Beast Coast, pretty close as well. It went 12 rounds, so 7-5. So, I mean, that's definitely a point in Dark Zero's camp. They beat Beast Coast even if it was close, and Parabellum lost to Beast Coast even if it was close. I think that was perhaps another instance of getting lucky when Beast Coast got to play them. I think Parabellum was a little bit shaky on the first day. I suppose you could also say that for Beast Coast. They're also a new team, so it's hard to call. But maybe Parabellum could have beaten Beast Coast if they played on a different day, even on the same day. If Parabellum hadn't choked one round, maybe they would have gone to overtime and then won in overtime. So it's hard to call, but all right, comparing against Dark Zero one more time. Parabellum has a loss against Oxygen, which is perhaps the least embarrassing team to lose against, and they have a win against the Sonics, which is perhaps the least impressive team to have a win against at this point. Parabellum also has the least decisive win against Sonics of anybody, so that they got a 7-3 as opposed to the 7-0, the 7-1, and the 7-2 that were also dealt out to Sonic. So again, not losing to the best team, not that bad, but also beating the worst team isn't that good. Dark Zero also lost to Astralis. This was in overtime, so it's good to take them to overtime. Obviously, it would be better if they beat them, and Dark Zero would obviously be higher up if they had beaten Astralis, but they did lose. And okay, so I think there's a lot of factors that do go Dark Zero's way, but because of the head-to-head, because it was a 7-4 victory, maybe even a 7-5 would be enough for me to put the other order. But I think because of the decisive win, Parabellum also, you know, they lost to Oxygen, whereas Dark Zero hasn't played Oxygen. There's just a lot of factors, and I think this is perhaps the closest one to call, but I'm going to put Parabellum above Dark Zero for now. And all right, so moving up, Beast Coast and Xset are the next 2 teams. So Xset, once again, is tied on with these 2 on points at 6 points. Beast Coast has additional points, but both of these teams are 2-2. Beast Coast just had their loss in one of their losses in overtime, whereas Xset's both of their losses came in regulation. But also Xset's 2 losses came in the first week, and they got 2 wins in the second week. Beast Coast, so their very first playday, they played against Parabellum. That was a 7-5. Xset also played against Parabellum this last week. That was a 7-1. So Xset, much better win against Parabellum. Both of these teams also played against the Sonics, and Beast Coast beat them 7-2, but Xset beat them 7-0. So another superior win by Xset. Those are 2 big factors. Beast Coast does have the additional points, so they did go to overtime, but Xset, with those 2 superior wins and also only having won this last week and super dominantly, I think that these are enough factors to put Xset above Beast Coast for the time being. And I mean, that's still pretty impressive. Obviously, we're in the top 5 territory now. These 3 will be the top 3. But right, Xset and Beast Coast, this is a far cry from where these teams were last season. And, you know, it's different teams, but the same org. So it still perhaps looks a little bit jarring. And okay, so let's keep moving up. And I mean, this is obvious. I don't think there's even much debate. We're just going to throw it up there. Oxygen, obviously the best team. They have not lost a game. They haven't gone to overtime, so that's just 4 regulation wins. They haven't even gone max regulation. They have a 7-4, a 7-3, and a couple of 7-2s. Yeah, they're very clearly the strongest looking team at the moment. They do play against Space Station in the next playday, so if Space Station do beat Oxygen, I think it's very possible for Space Station to just go up to number 1. But if Oxygen gets first place, they're like almost locked in. It seems like nobody can challenge them at that point. And okay, so we have these 2 to talk about, and you know they're doing pretty well as well. Both of these teams have 3 wins, but they have 1 overtime win apiece, putting them each on 8 points, whereas Oxygen is on at 12 points, so they're a full 4 points above. Even if Oxygen loses and both of these teams win in regulation in the next playday, Oxygen will still be above them in terms of standings. So, and that's entirely possible if Space Station do beat Oxygen and then Astralis just wins their game. That could happen, but the standings will. They will not fall out of first place in the standings in just the next playday. Okay, so Space Station versus Astralis. This matchup did happen, and I think that's going to be extremely important in determining who the better team is. So each of them took a loss, and each of them has an overtime win and then 2 regulation wins. So, and I already mentioned it, so let's just talk about the game against each other. It was pretty close, but that wasn't an overtime game or anything. It was a 7-5 victory for Astralis. Space Station took an early lead, and then Astralis got, I think, 6 in a row, right? Space Station got 3 in a row, so 1 more, and they would have gone to overtime. But Astralis did manage to stop the comeback. I do want to say, I believe that if it had been a best of 3, that Space Station would have won. I mean, that's difficult to call because they would have been down a map. They would have had to win the next 2 maps. And maybe even if they had played each other on a map besides Border or like Skyscraper, maybe Space Station would have won. Astralis just looks really good on the new maps, but this is all terribly conjecturous. It's not that, it doesn't matter that much. It was a close win for Astralis, but a win outside of overtime nonetheless. So big point for Astralis there. And then, okay, so looking at their overtime games in this last playdate, Astralis versus Dark Zero went 8-6, and Space Station versus TSM went 8-6. So these 2 teams are right next to each other in the standings. The same scoreline. I think these pretty well cancel out. Maybe Dark Zero's looked a bit better than TSM because TSM, I guess, is on 1-3 and Dark Zero's on 2-2. But it's still like pretty close. I'll just cancel them out. And then going back a little bit further, we have Space Station versus Mirage and Astralis versus Sonics. And Sonics, I guess, look freer than Mirage. You do have to consider, I guess, Space Station was a 7-2 over Mirage, whereas Astralis was a 7-1 over Sonic. So again, it's like really close. I'm just going to cancel it out. And then that leaves only one other thing to consider, and that is their other game that each of them played. So Astralis lost to Oxygen, and it was a 7-3, so not terribly close, but Oxygen also just looks incredible. So it is what it is. Probably the least bad loss to have, except for maybe Space Station versus Astralis, because that is who we are comparing. And then Space Station's other win was versus XSET. So 7-3, and perhaps they were also fortunate to be able to play XSET in the first week just like TSM was. But, that is still defeating the 4th highest team on the power ranking right now, regardless of when it was. So, it is tough to call, and because I think there's 2 things that cancel out, and then this is not a bad loss, this is a good loss. It's super tough. I guess I'm just going to put Astralis over Space Station based on the head-to-head. Well, maybe you could switch these 2, but I'm going to put them above them for now pretty well off the merit of the head-to-head. And then, again, at least Oxygen at the top. So do I want to reorder these tiers a little bit? I think I'll maybe even do this and this, something like that. Okay, yeah, I think Oxygen belongs in a tier of their own, and perhaps even Sonic's in a tier of their own. And maybe this is even more proper to do. Yeah, these teams are all within 1 point of each other. I guess Beast Coast is also within 1 point of these guys, but I think there's like a gap. So this is the 4-0 team. These are the 3-1 teams. These are the 2-2 teams. Yeah, and these are the 1-3 teams, and these are the 0-4 team. This is the 0-4 team. So yeah, it does boil down to just that. So I think that's the fairest way to arrange them within tiers. I think these 2 could be switched. Maybe these 2 can be switched. I think that's probably above Beast Coast. These 2 also very close, could be switched, and maybe even these 2. So a lot of switching could go around, but I think within the tiers, it is pretty well set. I guess I'll mention the upcoming Playday for predictions. I'll be doing that in another video, but that's going to be super hard to call. I mean, get hyped for that day because we have Beast Coast versus XSET. So these 2 teams right next to each other in the power ranking. Dark Zero versus TSM. These 2 teams right next to each other in the ranking. Mirage versus Sonics also next to each other. And then we have Astralis versus Parabellum. A little bit of a gap here. Astralis, I guess, have like 4 places higher than Parabellum, but still they're in adjacent tiers. And then we have Space Station versus Oxygen, also close to each other. So this could wreck anyone's and mine, my prediction rating. That might be unfortunate. So it's going to be a really tough day, but for the predictions, for the teams, but it should be a very entertaining day to watch. Hopefully we can get maybe some overtime or at least some close games, because NAL tends to have some not very close games a lot of the time. And yeah, I guess that's everything to talk about here. If you think anything on this tier list is terribly wrong, let me know. If you think some of these should be switched, I already mentioned a little bit, but if you think pretty strongly about it, feel free. Yeah, so comments, concerns, questions, whatever you got, leave them below in the comments section. Leave me a like and a sub, it helps me out. And all right, with all of that being said, I will catch you guys in the next video.